Putin has at last decided on a massive mobilization. That's the logical conclusion one can indeed draw from the law that he has just signed into effect. Look, here's a report from Russian public channels. In Russia's regions, a mass mobilization of volunteers for the protection of critical infrastructure has begun. On November 4th, Putin signed into law an act that now permits the utilization of reservists for various duties, not exclusively during times of war, but also throughout periods of peace. According to Kommersant, this work is already in progress across 20 regions of the country. The reservists, who will primarily be deployed to counter Ukrainian drones, will be granted military personnel status, along with all entitled benefits, encompassing social guarantees and payments. So let's break this down. It seems like this is some kind of a distorted reflection. So initially, we're talking about volunteers here. This is in the very same message from the official Kremlin Telegram channel. Volunteers, then we see they are reservists, and then we see they are given the status of military personnel with all the corresponding benefits. Why do I conclude this is indeed that substantial mobilization that Putin had resisted for an extensive period, held off and so forth, yet by the close of the 4th year of the full-scale invasion, he was finally pressured into it and opted to proceed? Why? Because I have a message from. Here it is, Nejad, which is also a Z-channel cesspool. But listen, they provide official data for the Russian Federation. Friends, based on official figures, there are approximately 2 million reservists who are currently receiving monthly disbursements from the Ministry of Defense. On November 4th, Putin signed a law allowing citizens who have signed a contract to be in the reserve to be called up for special training to protect critical infrastructure. Both civilian and military infrastructures are affected, so this potentially amounts to about 2 million people. I highly doubt that Putin, by declaring such a large-scale mobilization, would be so imprudent as to further agitate his already considerably uneasy entourage. I'm referring to the regional elites who have frankly exhausted their funds for contracts, making it impossible to immediately place 2 million reservists on those very same contracts for the same pay. Clearly, there's no money available, which is exactly why this clever maneuver was devised. But let's call up reservists, though not all at once, and not for all the money in the world, right? So let's say 10% of these reservists, that's 200,000. I believe that's a plausible figure. Even 200,000, considering the vastness of the Russian Federation, constitutes a massive mobilization. Next, we must clarify. This signifies the number of regions participating in this process. Here is another graphic, also from Russian public channels, because this is a topic that's being very actively discussed right now. This, in fact, comes as a surprise even to Russians themselves, not only to those who back-ending the SMO within the Russian Federation, but also to ordinary citizens. Thus, these are the regions establishing reservist groups to fight against UAVs. And so we observe regions such as Kaliningradskaya, Leningradskaya, Nizhny Novgorodskaya, Oblasts, Perm Krai, Pskovskaya, Smolenskaya, Yaroslavskaya, Bryanskaya, Kurskaya, Tulskaya, Tambovskaya, Tverskaya, Rostovskaya, Samarskaya are involved. We can also observe the Tyumen region as well as the Krasnoyarsk Krai. Chuvashia, Tatarstan, and Bashkiria are also involved. So there are 20 regions that are currently involved in performing this specific work and fulfilling these tasks. For some reason, I don't see Amur Oblast here, nor Murmansk Oblast either. This is rather surprising given they are precisely some of the most problematic regions or constituent entities within the Russian Federation where an open conflict with the Kremlin exists regarding compensation and deductions from local budgets for contracts related to the so-called SMO. You see, for this reason, as my colleague mentioned, to avoid triggering them, neither the Amur governors and their entourage nor the Murmansk ones are being touched. Although things are becoming very interesting there right now, so we're seeing perhaps more loyal situations unfold. where some are precisely the ones who follow the prevailing trends set by the Kremlin. Therefore, it is evident that they are involved in the initial stage of this process, contributing in some specific proportion and quantity. Today, I came across a rather insightful clarification from Mr. Denisenko, who served as a former advisor to the Ukrainian Minister of Internal Affairs. This explanation specifically pertained to the ongoing mobilization efforts within the Russian Federation. How does he see it? Well, he hypothesizes that the main task, obviously, is to accumulate an additional 100 to 150,000 of these reservists over the winter, who could potentially replace losses. Obviously, perhaps, I don't know. How much will the contract side of things possibly sag? Maybe it won't be about replacing losses, but about getting people for less money. You know, like 5 for the price of 1. Well, not a $10,000 severance like in Krasnodar Krai, but rather 5 men for that same $10,000, $2,000 each, perhaps. Next, these so-called reservists will undoubtedly find themselves on the front lines in a matter of months. No doubt, employing them to guard against UAVs, oil refineries, or critical infrastructure is complete nonsense. The Russian Federation, its army, and particularly Gerasimov's general staff require cannon fodder. Because it is rather challenging to implement the ideas that Putin is currently discussing and aspiring to achieve today. Wouldn't you agree? And Pokrovsk with bare hands, well, as you can see, they just haven't managed to capture it by the 15th, as they confidently asserted, haven't they? By November 15th, well, there you have it. So now let's bring in additional reservists throughout the winter. Denisenko adds, the system prevents any riots. That's an interesting question Mr. Denisenko raises. So, revolts. And, well, look, in our estimation, the Russian Federation's army essentially equates to money. The main motivation for these orcs who are sent off somewhere as cannon fodder is money. And secondly, it's an opportunity for individuals convicted of serious crimes to secure release from incarceration. This can be achieved by making atonement in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, potentially through their demise while serving in the occupied Donbas region. So that's the story. In other words, it's absolutely not about riots. I can actually fully and wholeheartedly agree with that particular statement. Next. Alongside mobilization, payments to contract soldiers are decreasing in several regions. Well, I've already explained that. This mobilization will drain a much higher quality human resource. This is also interesting because who are reservists in principle? These are people with specific military professions, obviously, right? These are individuals possessing a distinct qualification for which they actually persist in receiving payments from the Ministry of Defense. These are individuals who possess a particular societal standing. And this signifies that it's no longer just some undesirables who were effectively purged for nearly 4 years. Rather, these are now people of a discernibly different social stratum and background. And Denisenko writes that this will definitely hit the labor potential hard, but we won't see the cumulative effect for at least 12 months. I don't know about that. Is a mobilization of 100 to 150,000 bad for Russia with 150 million people and a cumulative effect? I have serious doubts about that. I simply think the war is now starting to knock on numerous doors simultaneously. And this will no longer pertain solely to the Kremlin's relationships and the regional elites. This now represents the direct communication between their so-called leader, Tsar Putin, and a significant number of individuals who hold a level of education surpassing that of a mere secondary school diploma. You see? And this means the war is knocking on every Russian's door. The mobilization in the Russian Federation is forced. This absolutely counts as good news for Ukraine. Why? Because now every Russian will feel it more and more closely and therefore will resist it. The bad news is this mobilization involves tens, maybe over 100,000 individuals who will end up in Donbas, on Ukraine's southern front. These people must be engaged, and Ukraine will need a certain capability, yes, involving additional effort and an increased amount of money, which is currently being very actively pursued. However, there isn't really any particularly good news about large volumes of weapon supplies like Patriot systems or other things, and these are not available. As you know, many issues remain unresolved, including the F-16 program, and regarding the matter of frozen Russian assets, among other things, and so forth. Today, Peskov, quite clearly within the scope of this entire situation, also issued a rather muddled statement concerning the continuation of the war, the so-called SMO. He stated that, yes, the war would indeed end when we have all completely fulfilled our objectives in Ukraine. But we want it to be sooner, right? And here's the thing. So you want it sooner? Ready to negotiate, or will you pursue all your objectives which are clearly unattainable? But considering this news about the mobilization law, well, there's a certain logic here because this is a signal, not so much to Ukraine or the United States. It's a signal to Russia's interior and other regions like Leningrad you also saw. It's about them saying, look, we're still going to keep on fighting for a while and we're planning to come for each and every one of you. So the question is, what's next? Right, what's going to happen next? The Kremlin snuff box, a channel closely linked to Putin's administration, considers three scenarios. There are three options. First, there will be a big mobilization, but we will only draft reservists. There are enough. We'll find hundreds of thousands for the SMO, and the experience with enemy drones will be useful. Second, we will simply start mobilization. Reservists will go to fight, and not only them. Now, the second scenario appears to be quite realistic, in my opinion. Third scenario, SMO ends, no mobilization needed. Well, this particular option, I find it quite challenging to fully believe, stated our insider from the Ministry of Defense. Well, it's a developing situation, and it's not yet clear how it will actually play out in the end. However, it is already quite clear and very apparent now that and the regional elites in the Russian Federation are presently morphing into what can be described as a caste-like societal structure. Yes, there are those who are against the SMO, and that's obvious. There are those who support the Kremlin, and that's also obvious. However, it's undeniably evident that both sides have exhausted their funds for the SMO and contract engagements. Consequently, reservists will now have to subsist solely on their base salaries. And I think that I highly doubt it, but I would really hope that all of this could somewhat destabilize that particular situation. Vatnik mindset.